Jim Hutton went home to Ireland. He left London after Freddie Mercury died on November 24, 1991, and he went back to Carlow, the small town in the Irish Midlands where he had grown up, and he was quiet. Not briefly quiet. Not quiet for a few months while he processed what had happened. Quiet for years. The press wanted to talk to him. The documentaries wanted to talk to him. The biographers were calling. He was the person who had been there, who had lived with Freddie Mercury at Garden Lodge for 6 years, who had been in the room when Freddie died, who knew things about those 6 years that nobody else knew. And he said nothing. For 6 years, he said nothing. And then, in 1994, he wrote a book, Mercury and Me, 300 pages. 6 years of a life that nobody outside Garden Lodge had been allowed to see. He gave it completely. He held almost nothing back. Almost. There is still one thing he kept, one thing that is not in the book, one thing that Jim Hutton took with him when he died on January 1st, 2010, and that has not been given to anyone since. This video is about the 6 years and about what he kept. Jim Hutton was a hairdresser from Carlow, County Carlow in the Irish Midlands. He had been working in London at the Savoy Hotel, one of the most prestigious addresses in the city, when he met Freddie Mercury at a bar in 1984. He was 35 years old. Freddie Mercury was 37. The meeting, by Jim Hutton's account in Mercury and Me, was not dramatic. Freddie Mercury approached him. Jim was not interested. Freddie Mercury asked for his phone number. Jim gave him a false one. Freddie Mercury found him anyway. The way people who are accustomed to getting what they want find people who are not expecting to be found. And the relationship that followed was not what the public expected a relationship with Freddie Mercury to look like. It was not glamorous in the tabloid sense. It was domestic. Jim cooked. Jim gardened. Jim was, by the account of Peter Freestone and the others who were at Garden Lodge in those years, the specific kind of quiet presence that Freddie Mercury needed around him, someone who was not performing for him, not seeking proximity to the fame, simply present, simply there. Garden Lodge in Logan Place in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was the house Freddie Mercury bought in 1980 and spent the rest of his life making into the home he had always wanted. It was not a rock star's house in the expected sense. Not ostentatious, not designed for parties. It was a private house, a garden, a Japanese room, a cat or several cats at any given time. Freddie Mercury's taste, which ran to fine art and porcelain and the specific quiet comfort of beautiful domestic objects, was everywhere in it, and Jim Hutton lived in it with him for 6 years. He was not a guest. He was not the famous one's partner who existed in the margins of the famous life. He was the person who knew what Freddie Mercury was like when the costume was off, what he was like in the morning, what he ate, what he worried about, what made him laugh in the kitchen. The 6 years at Garden Lodge are the private years, the years that Garden Lodge was designed to protect from exactly the kind of attention it has received since 1991. Jim Hutton was the keeper of those years. Jim Hutton was the keeper of those years, and he kept them. For 6 years after Freddie Mercury died, he kept them entirely. No interviews, no documentaries, no press statements, no accounts of what the 6 years at Garden Lodge had contained. The biographers wrote about him without him. The documentaries showed photographs of him without his narration. The world built its understanding of Freddie Mercury's private life from the accounts of other people. Peter Freestone, Mary Austin, the inner circle, while Jim Hutton was in Carlow, gardening, living the small and quiet life he had lived before London. And the world, which had decided it owned Freddie Mercury's story, kept knocking. Jim Hutton kept not answering for 6 years, and then he answered. In 1994, Jim Hutton published Mercury and Me. He wrote it with Tim Wapshott. It was published in Britain and Ireland and in several other countries. It was not a tabloid memoir, not the kind of book that takes private information and sells it as scandal. It was a careful, specific, detailed account of what the 6 years had been, how the relationship had started, what their daily life had looked like, what Freddie Mercury had been like at home, away from the stage and the press and the public identity, and critically, what the years of illness had looked like from inside. Jim Hutton had been there through all of it, The diagnosis that Freddie received in 1987. The years of keeping the diagnosis private, the gradual physical decline, the last months, the last days, the room. Jim Hutton had been in all of those places. He was the person who had been closest to Freddie Mercury in all of them. And in Mercury and Me, he described them. Not completely, almost completely. What Mercury and Me gave was specific and irreplaceable. It gave the domestic interior, the garden lodge that no photograph and no documentary had fully captured. The breakfasts. The garden Jim tended with a care that Freddie Mercury apparently found both touching and slightly absurd. The cats Tom, Jerry, Delilah, Goliath, Oscar, Tiffany, Dorothy that Freddie Mercury loved with an intensity that the people who knew him have all described as genuine and unperformed. The specific, ordinary rhythms of two people who had built a life together. None of that had been in any previous account, and it gave the illness years. Jim Hutton described receiving his own HIV diagnosis alongside Freddie Mercury's, both of them in the doctor's office together, both of them learning at the same moment. He described the decision to keep the diagnosis private. The years of management, of medication, of the specific discipline required to continue working, continue performing, continue being Freddie Mercury in public while being seriously ill in private. He described all of this with the specific restraint of someone who understands the difference between what is his to give and what belongs to the person who is no longer there to consent. What Mercury and Me kept was harder to identify because the book was generous and detailed and appeared to hold nothing back. But the people who had been inside Garden Lodge Peter Freestone, the inner circle, the people who knew what Jim Hutton knew have noted in the years since the book's publication, that there is a quality of reserve in certain sections that is not simply discretion. It is the reserve of someone who has decided consciously to give a great deal and to keep something specific. Jim Hutton described the last days. He described the room on November 24th, 1991. He described being present when Freddie Mercury died. He gave those hours to the reader with the specific seriousness they deserved, and he stopped at a particular point. There is a moment in the account of Freddie Mercury's death that Jim Hutton reaches and then steps back from. Not because the account ends, because something specific is withheld. What was said in those final hours between two people who had lived together for 6 years and who both knew what was happening, the exact words, the specific private exchange, Jim Hutton did not put in the book. Jim Hutton did not put in the book. The people who have read Mercury and Me carefully and who have compared it to the other accounts of those final hours from the other people who were present, Peter Freestone, the members of Queen, the inner circle, have all noted the same gap. Not a gap in the timeline, not a gap in the emotional honesty of the account, a gap at a specific point. The last private conversation between Jim Hutton and Freddie Mercury. What passed between them in those hours? Jim Hutton described everything around it. He described the room. He described the physical reality of what was happening. He described his own feelings, the grief, the helplessness, the specific quality of being present at the death of the person you have shared your life with. And then, at the specific moment of the last exchange, the account becomes general. The specific words are not there. Jim Hutton knew what was said. He chose not to say it. After Mercury and Me was published, Jim Hutton went back to the quiet. He gave interviews in the period around the book's publication, the specific promotional appearances of someone who has written something and is supporting it. And then, largely, he stopped. He went back to Carlow. He tended his garden. He lived a small and quiet life. He was not entirely invisible. There are occasional photographs from the years between the book and his death, occasional appearances at Queen-related events, the specific visible presence of someone who has chosen to be present without being prominent. Jim Hutton was HIV positive. He had been diagnosed in 1987 alongside Freddie Mercury. He managed his health through the 1990s and the 2000s with the treatment that became available as the epidemic's medical landscape changed. He was not silent about his own illness in the way that he was silent about the private version of the relationship. He spoke about HIV when asked. He did not speak about the last private conversation. He carried that with him into the Irish Midlands, into the garden in Carlow, for the 19 years between Mercury and Me and his death on January 1st, 2010. Garden Lodge was sold after Freddie Mercury's death. Mary Austin, who had been left the house in Freddie Mercury's will, lived in it and then sold it. The address Logan Place, Kensington, became a specific location for the people who needed somewhere physical to put their grief. Fans wrote on the walls outside, left flowers, left photographs, left the specific objects of grief that people leave when the person they have lost did not belong to them, but felt as if they did. Jim Hutton did not participate in any of this publicly. He had had the real thing. 6 years of the real house, the real person, the real domestic life behind the walls that the fans were writing on. He did not need the outside of the wall. He had been inside, and the inside, the specific, ordinary, extraordinary reality of what Garden Lodge had been when Freddie Mercury was alive inside it was what Jim Hutton carried. What he gave in the book. What he kept in the part of the book where the account became general and the specific words were not there. The specific words were not there. And Jim Hutton died on January 1st, 2010, in Carlow at the age of 60. He had been ill. The HIV diagnosis from 1987 had eventually, despite 2 decades of managed treatment, ended where it ended. He died quietly in the town where he had grown up, far from London in Garden Lodge, and the world that had built itself around the memory of Freddie Mercury. He did not give a final interview. He did not release a statement. He did not describe in any recorded form the last private conversation. It went with him. Whatever was said between Jim Hutton and Freddie Mercury in those final hours, the specific words that the book approached and then stepped back from is not recoverable. It is gone. It was his to keep. He kept it. What the relationship between Jim Hutton and Freddie Mercury actually was, underneath the book, underneath the photographs, underneath the various accounts of the people who were at Garden Lodge in those years, is a question that Mercury and Me answers almost completely and not quite completely. Jim Hutton described love, not in the elevated language of a memoir that has been written for an audience, in the specific, ordinary language of someone describing a relationship that was domestic and daily and real. He described cooking for Freddie Mercury. He described the gardening. He described the arguments, small domestic arguments about ordinary things. He described the diagnosis and what it did to both of them. He described the years of illness. He described the death. And underneath all of this specific, ordinary description is the shape of something very large. A relationship that lasted 6 years and contained the entire arc of a person's final chapter. From the relative health of 1985 to the death in November 1991. Jim Hutton was there for all of it. He saw it all. He gave almost all of it, and the piece he kept, the last private words, was the piece that belonged most entirely to the two of them. What we know about the 6 years at Garden Lodge is substantial. Mercury and Me is a detailed book. Peter Freestone's memoir, Freddie Mercury, an intimate memoir, adds another layer. The various documentaries, the authorized biography, the accounts of the inner circle, all of it fills in the picture. What we know: Jim Hutton loved Freddie Mercury. Freddie Mercury loved Jim Hutton. They built a domestic life together in a house in Kensington that was designed to protect exactly that kind of private, ordinary life from the outside world. They both knew they were ill. They navigated that knowledge together, in the specific privacy that Garden Lodge provided. And at the end, Jim Hutton was there, in the room present. What we don't know is the specific, what was said, what passed between them in those last hours that Jim Hutton described the edges of and never described the center of. That center belongs to the two of them, to the person who is gone and to the person who took it with him. It is not ours. It was never ours. It was never ours. This is the thing that the story of Jim Hutton and Freddie Mercury keeps returning to. The fame is public. The music is public. The Live Aid performance and the Bohemian Rhapsody and the 72,000 people at Wembley, all of that is public, recorded, available, permanent. But the person inside all of it, the person at Garden Lodge, in the kitchen, in the garden, in the room, on November 24th, 1991. That person was private, belonged to the people who were actually there. Jim Hutton was one of those people. He gave what he could give. He kept what was not his to give. And when he died in Carlow on January 1st, 2010, he took with him the specific private version of the last 6 years of Freddie Mercury's life that belonged to no one else. The public version exists. The music exists. The performances exist. The private version, the last conversation, the specific words does not exist for us. It existed for Jim Hutton. It exists now only in the form of the gap he left in the book where the words should have been. Jim Hutton went home to Ireland. He lived with Freddie Mercury for 6 years. He was there when Freddie died. He went back to Carlow. He was quiet for 6 years. And then he wrote the book. He gave almost everything. He kept one thing, the last private words, the specific exchange that the book approached and stepped back from. He carried it through the 19 years between the book and his death. He died on January 1st, 2010, in the town where he had grown up. He took it with him. The public story is complete. The music is here. The performances are here. The 65 years of Freddie Mercury's life are documented in more detail than almost any life has ever been documented. But the last private conversation, the specific words between two people who had spent 6 years building a life together and who both knew the life was ending, those words are gone. They belong to the two of them. They always did. Jim Hutton understood that. He kept it. He was right to keep it.